Jeff Grubb. The Brothers' War. Magic: The Gathering. Artifact Cycle. Book 1. Prologue. Opposites Attract. It was the night before the end of the world. The two armies had gathered on opposite sides of a blasted vale. Once this had been a verdant valley, its wide plain shaped by a wide, meandering stream, its flanking hills blanketed by thick groves of oak, larchwood, and ironroot. Now these trees were gone, no more than ragged stumps remained, the grass burned away, and the earth beneath packed hard and barren. The stream was a sluggish flow hidden by a thick film of oil, its surface broken only by the shadowy masses of nameless solids. Thick, inky clouds concealed the moons and stars from sight. It had been overcast and cold on Argoth, despite unseasonably warmer weather elsewhere on Terisiare. Both sides in the upcoming battle had taken to torching the forest they found, if only to deny their opponents supplies and support. By day the cloud canopy was a dull grey, a sheet of rolled and unfinished steel. By night it was lit only from below by the thousands of campfires and foundries that now dotted the landscape. Along the opposite rims of the vale the flames lit by both invading forces glimmered like evil eyes in the darkness. Spanning the shallow stream was a pair of toppled giants, remnants of an earlier battle between one of the invaders and the original inhabitants of this land. One of the fallen giants had been made of living wood, and had been splintered into 1,000 shards. Its huge forested head lay on the ground, screaming silently to the uncaring night. It had been the last champion of the natives of Argoth, the avatar of the goddess, and with its death passed away all hope for the island people. The victor in the battle had also been destroyed in the struggle. This huge humanoid monster was made of stone, its joints constructed of massive plates of pitted iron and great brass gears. Its lithic body had been broken and patched a number of times, and great sheets of metal had been bolted to its hide to hold it together. The battle with the living forest beast had overtaxed its pistons and armatures. Its final lunge had splintered its opponent. Now it sprawled forward, face down, bridge over the tepid stream. One of the stone giant's arms had been ripped loose from the battle and lay a few hundred feet away, its fingers raised to claw the sky. On the back of the granite giant's silent corpse a lone figure waited. In his youth he had been broad-shouldered and handsome, but the years of war and service to his master had exhausted him. His shoulders were slumped now, and his frame carried the additional weight of both his responsibilities and his age. His once dazzled blonde hair was worn short, and the first patch of skin was apparent at the crown of his head, herald of eventual baldness. Still, he was taller than most of this fellows, so others did not see it unless he was seated. For the moment he paced along the giant's back. Taunos pulled his rough, brown woolen cloak tighter around him, cursing the cold and dark. As he did so, his fingers scraped against the metal breastplate beneath. It did not fit him very little that he had not been made specifically for his large frame. And he had brought it along only as an afterthought. The message had been warm and welcoming, but it came from the enemy camp. Urza would be irritated if his former student let his guard down so easily. There was motion along the far side of the giant's back, near where its smashed head lay at a twisted angle to the rest of the body. Taunos did not see her climb up, but suddenly she was there. A flash of red hair surrounded by an ebon cloak. It was as if she wore a piece of the night itself, and wore it very well. She was alone, as she had promised. As she crossed toward him, Taunos pulled a small device from his pocket. It was a flattened sphere with a lamp's wick jutting from the top. He pressed a stud along the side of the sphere, and the device sputtered. The wick burst into a brief yellow flame, which subdued to a soft orange hue as Taunos manipulated the small stud along the side. Ashno drew into the light, and he saw that she had that bemused smirk that he had always found attractive. He also saw that there were now silver hairs among the scarlet. "I'd heard you were dead," he said. "Don't believe everything you hear, duck," replied Ashno the uncaring with a broad smile. "I've heard I died at least 5 times in the past 10 years. The smile faded and the voice turned solemn. "You came. Thank you. You sent a message," said Taunos. "It could have been a trap," said Ashno. "It could have been," admitted Taunos, and opened his cloak. His breastplate reflected the small light which glimmered off the 2 sets of ornate weapons that rode on his hips. Ashno smiled again. "Good to know you're still cautious," she said. "Prepared," observed Taunos. "That is all." "Prepared." Ashno slung her pack on the ground and knelt next to it. Taunos hesitated, then joined her. They sat in relative silence for a long moment. Far off in the distance on either side of the veil were the hammers of forges preparing for the bloody business of the next day. "You sent a message," prompted Taunos. "This is the last one, you know," said Ashno, staring out into a night pierced by red fires. "The last battle. The final conflict. One way or another, the resolution of the war between your master and mine." "Between Urza and Mishra," said Taunos with a nod. "They are both here," Ashno added. "There are no reinforcements. No retreat is possible for either side. One way or another, it all ends here." Taunos shifted uncomfortably. It had been a long time since he had sat cross-legged on hard stone. "It is a good time for a ending," he said. "All this has gone on far too long." Across from him, Ashno bowed her head in the light. "And wasted so much." "Many have lost their lives," agreed Taunos. Ashno giggled, an ill-placed sound that raised the hairs of Taunos's neck in irritation. "Lives," she said. "Lives are nothing. Think of all the forests gutted, the lakes drained, the lands plundered to get us to this point. Think what we could have done with those resources. And people, yes, how we could have used them otherwise." As she spoke, Taunos could feel his face tighten in disapproval. Even in the dim glow, Ashno could feel his silent irritation. "Sorry," she said at last. "I spoke before. Why? Thought. Good to know there are universal constants," said Taunos stonily. "Sorry." There was another pause, and in the distance, something clattered. It sounded like a mechanical demon laughing. "How is he?" she said at last. "The same, only more so," Taunos replied. "Yours?" Ashno shook her head. "Something's wrong." Taunos raised an eyebrow, and she added quickly, "Mishra's colder than ever. More calculating. I'm worried." "I always worry," said Taunos. "Urza has become more withdrawn over the passing years." "Withdrawn," said Ashno. "That's the word. As if we aren't even there. Like no one else is." She reached out to touch his shoulder. Taunos stiffened, leaning away, and she let the gesture Drop. You're right about it being a waste, she said at last. But it can be avoided even now. How? Taunos's eyes narrowed. Give him what he wants, said Ashno. Give Mishra the other half of the stone. Surrender. Taunos said, his voice too loud. After all, this surrender. When tomorrow we might carry the field. Before we came to Argoth, it might have been an option, perhaps. He thought a moment and said more to himself than to his companion. No, not even before. Ashno held up both hands in a pacific gesture. Just a suggestion, Duck. He sent you with that message. My words are my own, snapped Ashno. He doesn't trust me, she added softly. Who would, at this point? Asked Taunos. The words were out of his mouth before he realized what he said. Fine, she snarled, and stood up suddenly. She grabbed the knapsack, and it disappeared again within the shadows of her voluminous cloak. And I even came bearing gifts. Any gift from you would be treated suspiciously, said Taunos, scrambling to his feet and standing next to her. They paused for a moment, and a cold wind passed between them. Then Ashno turned to leave. Perhaps. Taunos began. She hesitated at his words. Perhaps we could get our two masters together, he continued. Without their weapons. Without their armies. Perhaps there's a way to make them both understand each other. Ashno shook her head. They are lockstepped into their actions now, as mechanical as their own inventions, as relentless as the phases of the glimmer moon. She gave a sad giggle. You dream of a time when they could understand each other. There was never such a time. She walked away from him, then paused and turned. Be careful. Tomorrow. May you survive the battle. She walked to the far end of the toppled giant and put her hood up. Her scarlet hair disappeared, and she merged once again with the shadows. Be careful yourself, said Taunos to the unresponsive darkness, and turned quietly toward his own camp. As he walked back, one part of his mind noted the condition of the field, seeing pitfalls Urza's troops would have to avoid. But another segment of his consciousness meditated on Ashnod's words, repeating them over and over. There was never such a time. Part 1. A Study in Forces. Chapter 1. Takasia. The Argivian archaeologist removed her lenses and rubbed her tired eyes. The desert grit was everywhere, all the more so when the stiff breeze blew eastward from the inland wastes. The desert air was warm as forge coals, but Takasia was glad for the gentle wind. Without the breeze it would be merely unbearably and stiflingly hot at the dig site. The aged researcher sat at an ornate table, a huge monstrosity with thick, fluted legs and a heavy top inlaid with polished shell. It was a gift from one of the noble families of Argive, a reward for straightening out an errant sign of their line. The heirloom looked almost comical perched on the outcropping that Takasia had claimed as her headquarters beneath it tarpaulin of pale grey tomekul muslin. The gift had been well-intentioned, and she could only imagine the expense incurred in sending the table out to her. The desert had already taken its toll. The hand-rubbed finish had been almost entirely blasted away by the sand-laden wind, and the wood beneath had cracked as the heat boiled away the liquids still locked within. Furniture suitable for an Argivian dressing room was much less acceptable in the desert. Still, it was a flat space, and Takasia appreciated it. The tabletop was littered with scrolls half shoved into their cases and survey maps weighted down by bits of rusted metal, the torn edges of the papers fluttering in the breeze. A particularly large chunk of bluish metal sat directly before Terisiare, damning her with its enigma. It looked like a parody of a human skull with a bat-like face and cold, impassive eyes of colored crystal set in the unfamiliar blue-tinted metal. The metal itself seemed as ductile and soft as copper, but bending it only caused it to reform slowly into its original shape. A set of Thran glyphs ran along the underside of the skull, which Terisiare had translated roughly as Suchi. Whether this was the name of the creature, its owner, or its manufacturer was a mystery to her. The skull's lupine lower jaw jutted forward, ending in a handful of fangs. The top of the skull had been peeled away to reveal a tangle of blue metal cables. Set among them was a single large gemstone, the shade of old glass worn beyond age and marred by a longitudinal crack along its top. Terisiare sighed. Even if her diggers could find the rest of this Thran artifact's body, it was unlikely that they would ever get it working again. The damage was too extensive, and even if they could recreate its form, the gemstone that provided its power was shattered. They had found only a double handful of such stones that were whole and functioning, glowing in rainbow hues. They could power the old Thran devices. The largest of those stones were shipped back to Argive for additional study and in exchange for support and supplies. A shadow touched the corner of her table, and Terisiare jumped slightly. She had been so involved with the skull that she had not seen anyone approach. She looked up into Lauren's dark face and wondered how long the girl had been there. Lauren was a noble's daughter and one of Terisiare's best pupils, though that was not saying much given the current crop of students. Early in Terisiare's career, she had accepted the financial support of many of the noble houses of Pendragon. In exchange, the houses would often ship their recalcitrant or rebellious junior members out to the desert for a summer to join the mad archaeologist in her excavation of Thran artifacts. To be honest, Terisiare thought most of the youths she received were guilty of nothing more than being typical young people, and the parents were only seeking to get them out of the manor house. Once on the site, their interest in the past varied from minimal to non-existent. They were glad to be away from the perfumed and protected courts of Pendragon, its petty intrigues, and most important, the parents. Terisiare entrusted them with as much responsibility as they accepted. Some supervised the phalange diggers, while others helped glean and catalogue the devices they brought to light. Still others were content to man the grape-shot catapults that flanked the camp and served as a deterrent to desert raiders and the scavenging rocks. The young men and women came, served the time, and fled back to the cities with enough tales to impress their friends and enough maturity to mollify the parents. And a few, such as Lauren, had the intelligence, the wisdom, and the presence of mind to come back after their first experience. Lauren was on her third season and coming into the full flower of womanhood. Terisiare knew it was only a matter of time before the girls started to care more for ball gowns and dinner parties than for artifacts and dig sites, but for this summer at least, she was pleased to have her there to help catalogue, organize, and coordinate. Terisiare blinked, pushed her spectacles back up on her nose, and arched an eyebrow at the student. Lauren would never speak until spoken to, though Terisiare was trying to break her of that habit. There was a pause, and then Lauren said softly, "The caravan." from Argive has arrived. Terisiare nodded. They had been watching the rising dust cloud from the east all morning, but she'd thought it would be late afternoon before Bligh's wagons would reach them. The old wagon master must have finally sprung for new beasts, or else the old aurochs had finally failed him. What Lauren meant was that Bligh's wagons had finally passed through the stockade gates, and Terisiare had best be there to save her students from the bad-tempered merchants. Should the mistress of the camp not be there too? Greet him. Lauren did not move, and Terisiare added, I will be down as soon as possible. If Bligh does not like it, let him stew. Lauren's lips compressed in a thin line, then the girl nodded and vanished. Terisiare sighed again. In 2 or 3 years Lauren would be ordering merchants like Bligh around effortlessly, but for now, she and most of the other students were cowed by the merchants' bluster. Terisiare watched Lauren's retreating form, clad in the cream-colored working shift that most female students labored in. She noted that the girl was already wearing her hair longer, in the fashion favored in the capital. Lauren's hair was long, dark, and thick, making her exotic among most of her compatriots. A touch of the desert was the saying among the Argivian nobility. It was not a compliment, but rather a tacit accusation that some desert barbarian was lurking in the family tree. Perhaps that was why Lauren kept coming back for the summers. It could not be family pressure. The last time Terisiare visited Penregan, Lauren's mother had made it quite clear that Lauren should curb such foolish endeavors as rooting around in the dust for scraps of metal. Terisiare looked out over the camp, a rough wall built around a collection of hills. The low, rolling hills were incised by dry washes and proved to be extremely productive of Thran artifacts. The stockade was more of a demarcation of territory than a true protection, but it kept what desert bandits that might prove a problem at bay. The barricade of piled stone was flanked by a pair of oversized catapults loaded with loose rubble to keep the rocks away. Within the walls, most of the activity of the camp was slow in the summer heat. One particular hill, where they had recovered the Suchi skull, proved particularly promising and was now covered with a grid of string and stakes for further examination. The slow-footed Onolits plodded to meet the wagons, steered by noble boys who enjoyed thwacking the great albino beasts with their makeshift goads. The gate had closed on the last wagon now, and a wide-girthed figure leapt from the led carriage, waving his arms in an animated fashion. Bligh seemed to enjoy terrorizing the students out here, perhaps because he had to kowtow to their parents back in Penregan. Terisiare smiled at the thought of Bligh back in the Argivian capital, hat in hand, head bowed slightly, trying to enunciate his requests without resort to curses. The desert was probably the best place for him as well. The archaeologist ran her hands through her short graying hair, trying to shake out any non-existent tangles. When she had been young, her hair had been longer and almost as dark and luxuriant as Lauren's. There might have been a touch of the desert in her family tree as well. Still, age tended to make all peoples equal, and her shorn locks were easier to care for in the desert. Terisiare gave the blue metal skull an affectionate pat and rose from her camp chair. She reached for her walking stick, a shattered fragment of wood and bright steel from some unknown Thran mechanism. She was still spry enough to justify the staff as a walking stick to aid her in navigating the uneven ground and not as a crutch, but aches in her joints in the cool of the early desert morning told a different tale. Terisiare took her time descending from her perch. Bligh would bluster and complain, but that never stopped him from dealing the artifacts and saleable loot he would bring back from the site was worth a long and arduous trip inland. It was no surprise, then, that once she reached the wagons, there was a wide circle of students and teamsters surrounding the wagon master. The surprise was the pair of young men that Bligh was berating. The two were strangers. One was dark-haired and stocky, and flinched every time Bligh bellowed. He was half hiding behind the other, a lean, tawny-haired boy who stood bolt upright, taking the full blast of the wagon master's thunder. "Frauds! Cheats! Liars!" shouted Bligh. The pair were all of 10 years old, Terisiare guessed. 12. At the outside. That was about the age nobles first considered sending the children out to Terisiare's camp. But these were not her students, and no new arrivals were expected until the beginning of the next season. Lauren was at one side of the crowd, looking both embarrassed by the scene and relieved that she was not the object of Bligh's temper. "You seek to cheat me. Now get busy unloading, you motherless dogs," sputtered Bligh, a crimson hue crawling through his face. The dark-haired boy raised his fists and took a step forward. The older blonde lad held out an arm to block his companion, but his eyes never left the wagon master. "Sirrah," he said calmly, though loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear, "we had a bargain. We would work for you to pay for our passage here. We are now here, so we will work for you no longer." Wagon Master Bligh turned an apoplectic purple. "You are agreed to serve as hands for the journey. The journey isn't over yet. We still have to get back to Penregan. But then we'll have to get back here on our own," exploded the stockier boy, leaning forward against the other's restraining arm. "What's going on here, Bligh?" said Terisiare. The wagon master wheeled on the scholar, blinking as if he had only just then noticed her. "A private matter, mistress." Terisiare. "Nothing more." The leaner of the two youths stepped forward. "You are Terisiare the scholar." "We not finished," Bligh started, but Terisiare held up a hand and replied to the youth. "I am," she said. "I am Urza," said the youth. "This is my brother Mishra." The sturdier of the two boys nodded, and the lean youth fished out a battered envelope from within his vest. The seal on the flap, the imprint of a familiar noble household, was intact, but it looked as if the letter had made the entire trip next to the boy's skin. Bligh drew in his breath sharply at the sight. Terisiare looked at the two youths, then at the wagon master. She slid a sand-blasted nail beneath the flap and popped the letter open. The script was fluid and well-formed, dictated to a scribe, but the signature along the bottom was recognizable, if weak and jerky. There was a silence for a moment as she read, and both Bligh and Mishra shifted impatiently, waiting for the opportunity to start the argument again. The youth Urza stood impassively, hands folded in front of him. Terisiare folded up the letter again and said thoughtfully, "Well, that's that." To the two boys she said, "Get your things and follow Lauren there to your quarters." To Bligh she said, "These two are now my responsibility. They're joining as students." The purplish hue returned to Bligh's face. "But they owe me half a trip. You're telling me that I have to let these snipes break an agreement just because of some letter. Terisiare let the wagon master complain. She watched the boys pull a pair of slender backpacks from one wagon and lope after the slim form of Lauren. Only when they had passed through the crowd and that crowd had dispersed to tend to the immediate business of unloading the supplies did she turn her attention to Bly. Your agreement was for them to work the way through their journey, she said sharply. When they arrived here, that journey ended. They're taking up residence here. Do you understand? There was steel in her voice, and even Bly knew he could not push the scholar around when she took this tone. Instead, he took a deep breath and forced himself to calm. Terisiare held up the letter. This is from their father, from whom I have not heard for many years. What do you know of him? Bly stammered for a moment, then said, he's not well at all. Remarried recently, a Viragard, a real vixen from a good family with her own children. He was taken seriously ill about a month before we left Penregan. He might be dead by this time. He might be, said Terisiare solemnly, or he might be too ill to see to his son's well-being. You didn't know about this letter, did you? The wagon master looked at his feet, embarrassed. No, you did not, continued Terisiare. Because if you had, you wouldn't have tried to lock those children into such a hard bargain. Full trip indeed. Knowing you, you probably worked those two as hard, your aurochs, if not harder. Because you knew that without the letter I wouldn't take them in on just their word. The new mother, she's a Hellkite, said Bly softly, by way of explanation. Wanted them gone, but wouldn't spend a groat on their well-being. Didn't want to dip into the family monies, since they're all probably hers right now. So you gave the boys a break, worked him like slaves, and tried to keep them, since no one would notice their fate, said Terisiare. That's low, even for you, Bly. Now get the supplies unloaded, and yes, I'll do a complete inventory, thank you. And then we'll load the wagons for return. There are some items there that will fetch you a goodly profit, despite your scandalous behavior. Terisiare wanted to lecture Bly a bit longer, but Lauren came running up. Mistress Terisiare, the new boys. Terisiare scowled at the student. The young girl had actually spoken up, so it must be important. Yes. They're in a fight, said Lauren, with Rick Lau and a couple of the other boys. Terisiare uttered a mild curse. Bly chuckled. I can always take them back if you want, scholar, he said. The scholar shot the wagon master a look that would skin an ox at 15 paces. To Lauren she said, get Armel and a couple of the other diggers to break it up and bring the boys to my tent. Lauren hesitated, and Terisiare practically stamped her foot. Now. The young girl disappeared in a puff of dust, and Bly said, I think that pair are more trouble than they're worth, if you don't mind me saying. I wouldn't be surprised, grunted the scholar. Their father was always a handful. So you're going to keep them? Asked the wagon master, shaking his head. Terisiare sighed. I owe their father that much. For an old favor. Must be some favor, said Bly. What did he give you? Only my freedom, said Terisiare, and turned away from the wagon master without waiting for a reply. Bly looked at Terisiare's back as she walked back up the hill. Was it his imagination, or did she seem to be older and more fragile than she had been a few moments ago? Then he heard horse Shouts among the wagons, and the thought was driven from his head. "You lot," he bellowed at the teamsters, throwing himself back into the work. "Have you never hauled freight before? That stuff's delicate. Handle it like you would your sister's newborn, or we don't get paid." The hill seemed steeper to Terisiare on the way up than it had on way down, and the boys were already waiting for her when she reached the top. Armel and Loran were there as well. The leader of the desert tribe diggers nodded sharply at Terisiare. In Phalange, the desert tongue, he said, "Watch the little one. He was all fists and bites when we pulled him off. So much fire in one so small." The big one bloodied Reclau's nose. "But nothing's broken." Terisiare responded in the same language. "Reclau deserves to have his nose bloodied. Tell him he's on kitchen duty for the rest of the month, and move the boys' gear to Havoc's barracks instead." Armel nodded and left the top. Loran made no move to leave until Terisiare instructed her to keep an eye on Bly. The archaeologist strode around her table, sliding the walking cane back into its holder, a drum-shaped basket made from an Onule's foot. She leaned on her palms on the desk and looked at the two boys. Their fine vests had been shredded in the battle, and Urza's pockets had been torn out in the fight. Mishra had acquired a black eye, and both boys showed numerous scratch marks. Terisiare sighed and lowered herself into her seat. The boys shifted uncomfortably. 15 minutes, she said at last. 15 minutes and you're already in a fight. A new record, even for this place. Both boys started talking at once. Urza said, "I would like to apologize on behalf of everyone involved." Mishra burst out with, "I'm sorry, but it really wasn't our fault if." Silence. Terisiare slapped the table hard. Sahar, the Suchi skull jumped slightly, and a piece of the pearl inlay bounced out of its setting. The two boys quieted immediately and shifted from one foot to another. Terisiare leaned back in her chair. "What happened?" The boys looked at each other, as if each were granting the other the chance to explain. By mutual if unspoken consent, Urza won the opportunity. "One of the older boys picked on my brother. I stopped him," he said primly. "A large boy with red hair and freckles." "Terisiare," said Terisiare. To Mishra she said, "And why was Reclau picking on you?" "No reason," said Mishra. Urza started to say something, but Terisiare held up a hand to silence him. After a long silence, Mishra added, "He said I was on his bunk." "And were you?" asked the scholar. Mishra shrugged. "I guess." Then, after a pause, he blurted out, "But he didn't have to be rude about it." "Reclau is rude about everything," said Terisiare. "You're going to have to get used to that if you stay here." To Urza she said, "You're the older brother, correct?" "I am," said Urza, but Mishra made a small coughing noise. Urza made a face and added, "I should say that Mishra and I were born in the same year. I was born on the first day of the year. Mishra was born on the last. So for all days but the last, I am a year older. On the last day, we're equal," piped Mishra as if pleased that his brother had corrected himself. Terisiare held up the letter from Urza's vest. "Do you know what this says?" Again, the two boys looked at each other. Terisiare sensed they were conferring in a secret language, one only they could hear. "Not exactly," answered Urza at last. Your father was a dear friend to whom I owe much, observed Terisiare. He wants me to look after you, to care for you should something happen to him. That means you're going to be staying here for quite a while. And that means working with me and my students. If you're uncomfortable with this arrangement, I can send you back with Bly, but to be honest, I don't know what kind of welcome would await you in Pendragon. Again the boys looked at each other. It was Mishra who spoke. This time, what is it that you do? I dig, said Terisiare. Or rather, I supervise others who dig. We are searching for artifacts out here. Do you know what I'm talking about? Remnants of the past, said Urza. Of a civilization that stood here long before Argive or any of the nations of Terisiare. Relics. That's right, said Terisiare. Artifacts that range in power. From small toys to great machines, machines that can do the work of many men. Like the big white ox things? Asked Mishra, almost unheard. Terisiare arched an eyebrow at the younger brother. Yes. Indeed. The onlets that we use as beasts of burden out here are artifacts, ones I created based on the designs we've pieced together of the artifact-creating race, the Thran. The onlets are strong, loyal, unthinking machines that are tireless workers. They require neither food nor water, and when they do at last break down, the fluids from their joints are used to brew a hearty beverage that we then trade with desert tribesmen for information and other artifacts. They sound very useful, said Urza. Terisiare leaned back in her chair. I'm impressed, Mishra. The framework is covered by stitched hides to protect the workings from the desert sands. I had one student who was quite handy with a needle. Most first-time students assume the onlets are alive, since the only things comparable are the aurochs. She chuckled. One of the pranks that Rick Lau and the other boys were probably planning was to assign you to feed an onulet and not to come back until it had finished its meal. How did you guess they weren't living? Mishra blinked, then furrowed his brow. I didn't guess. I just knew. Urza sniffed and said, the gate is wrong for something alive. It pitches forward when it takes a step. A real creature would be smoother. He looked at Terisiare and shrugged. I knew it too, but I didn't think it important enough to mention. The Thran must have been amazing people to have created it. Terisiare said, and what do you know of the Thran, young Urza? The sandy-haired boy planted his feet apart and put his hands behind his back, a recitation position Terisiare remembered from her own youth. The Thran were an ancient race that lived in this land many thousands of years ago. They created a number of wondrous devices, only a few of which have survived to the present day. The great clock of Pendragon's Grand Court is said to be a Thran artifact. Terisiare suppressed a smile. The device at the heart of that clock had been one of her earliest finds. But who were they? She asked. Who were the Thran? Were they human? Urza blinked, as if the question were odd. Of course. Why wouldn't they be? What proof can you offer? Asked Terisiare. Urza thought for a moment, and Terisiare noticed he dropped his head slightly as if trying to support a thought filled it with his chest. I don't remember anything saying they weren't. I assumed they were. Most people do, said the scholar. But the truth of the matter is we don't know. They might be human, yes. Armel, one of the Phalangi, has some folk stories about how the Thran were powerful gods who brought his people into this world, but their stories neglect any specifics. The Thran could have been minotaurs, elves, dwarves, or goblins, for all we know. "Oh, I hope they were minotaurs," said Mishra. "Those are neat-looking." Urza spread his hands before him and said dryly, "There was a carnival in Penregan when we were younger. Most of what Mishra knows of minotaurs comes from seeing one there. But the fact remains we don't know who the Thran were," continued Takasia. "And so we dig, we examine, and we try to piece together the parts of the past. The onoliths are a result of what we have learned. So, to a lesser extent, are the grape-shot catapults that guard the encampment. We do know that many of the Thran devices were powered by crystalline energy sources. We call them power stones. What the Thran called them is anyone's guess. We have a rough idea of their language, though precious little that has been written down. We have not found statuary, art, or pottery, nothing that implies the creative arts. We know they stripped this land bare, but don't know how they died off, whether by internal war, famine, or plague." She sighed. "We have no idea even of what they looked like. They could have looked like us. Or they could have looked like our friend here." She pushed the suchi forward on the desk and patted it. Mishra reached forward and grabbed the skull. Takasia was surprised by the speed that only desert predators and small children can manage. He turned it over and over in his hands. "Stop," began Takasia. She wanted to say, "Stop that," and put it back down, but she was too late. At the first sound from her, Urza leapt on his little brother. "Put it down," snapped the sandy-haired boy. "It might be dangerous." "It's not dangerous," snarled his darker-haired brother. "If it was dangerous, she'd keep it someplace where we couldn't touch it. Then it's fragile," shouted Urza. "You'll break it." "If I break it, it'll be because you made me," replied Mishra. The pair formed a tight knot, the suchi skull between them. "Give," shouted Urza. "No," responded Mishra. "Enough," roared Takasia, thundering both hands on top of the table. At once both boys were on their feet again, and the skull was rocking gently against the pearl inlay where it had been a minute before. The scholar scowled at the boys. "You two talk a good game, and seem to have enough energy to burn. Good enough. You're going to spend the rest of the month learning from the ground up. You'll start by working in the kitchen alongside Riklao, sir. I strongly recommend you figure out how to deal with him. If I have any more trouble with the pair of you, I'll send you back with Bly." She glared at him. "Do I make myself clear?" As one, both boys nodded. "Good." Takasia settled her thin frame in the chair. "Now, report to the mess tent and start peeling tubers. The serving. A big feast tonight for Bly's men. I trust there will be no more problems." Both boys nodded in unison again. Takasia waved him out, and they vanished from her top, leaving trails of dust behind them. As they scampered down the hillside, despite herself, Takasia smiled. They were so close in age, but the birth order set their attitudes. Urza was 10 yet carried himself as if he were much older and felt responsible for his younger brother. Mishra was nearly 10 but acted younger and was more exuberant. He would probably always be willing to try new things, thought Takasia, because Big Brother would be there to watch out for him. Still, she mused, a word to Riklau would probably be wise. Let him know she would not appreciate hearing he was making life difficult for the two newest and youngest students. That might create more hard feelings if the new children were known to be favorites, but that was a small price, and a temporary one. At the end of this season, this batch of young nobles would head back to Penregan, and a new group would take the place. The brothers should be capable of handling themselves by then, she thought, or they would be gone. Takesha's smile died as she picked up the metallic skull of the suit. She examined it carefully to see if the boys had damaged it further in the grappling. Somehow, she saw their fight had jostled the two halves of the power crystal together. The longitudinal crack had vanished, and the crystal now was a solid piece. More interesting, there was a flicker of light deep within the crystal, a weak glow but one that indicated that the crystal still held some of its energy. Takesha stared at the skull and its crystalline brain until Lauren came to fetch her for dinner with the wagon master's men and her own students. But her eyes and her thoughts strayed often during the meal to the two boys who had so recently arrived in the camp. Chapter 2. Ornithopter. Takesha did not send the boys back with Bly that trip, or for any other trip to Penregan for the next 6 summers. Urza came to terms with Riklau, and Mishra was more careful about sitting on others' bunks. Lauren went back to Penregan and stayed away for 5 years. Bly wore out the new oxen and tried to buy one of Takesha's ownlets, to no avail. Takesha continued to dig and to bring up the two boys put into her care. At first Takesha thought of Urza and Mishra as two parts of a single entity. Her inclination was reinforced by the way the two looked at each other before answering a question. Yet they were very different people, and the desert brought out different parts of their personalities. Urza became more studious, devouring every scrap of information that Takesha had gathered on the Thran. He pored over the rosters of artifacts from previous seasons and even the scrap heaps of material that had been discarded. In this fashion he found several pieces that belonged with later discoveries but had been discarded at the time. Urza, Takesha quickly discovered, was intrigued by the manner in which things worked. At 12 he took apart the front limbs of one of the ownlets, reassembling it only after Takesha threatened dire consequences. He and Mishra rebuilt the beast overnight, and their impromptu redesign stopped the lurching problem the machine had previously experienced. The elder brother grew lean and wiry in the hot sun. His hair bleached to a straw-colored blonde, and he now gathered it in a ponytail across the back of his neck. His knowledge was encyclopedic and his insights keen. Mishra bloomed in the dry desert era as well. While Urza burrowed through the tattered scrolls and maps, Mishra learned to dig, to sift, and excavate. The younger brother spent more time out in the field than did his sibling. He climbed among the exposed rock faces and dry washes. Soon he could look at a proposed excavation site and hazard a guess on how deep the excavators would have to go to before striking the Thran level of artifacts. More often than not, his guess proved right. Takesha noticed that Mishra spent more time with the other students than did his brother, and with Amal's diggers as well. After supper, while Urza was hunched over a ligature of some skeletal artifact, Mishra was to be found at the diggers' camp, listening to the legends of the Phalange peoples. There were tales of raids and heroes and desert genies, of great cities captured in bottles and hapless souls transformed into donkeys. Mishra learned of the Thran as the desert people knew them, a race of demigods who had used their artifacts to create wonderful, terrible cities. Terisiare suspected that the diggers let Mishra sample the nabis, the powerful fermented wine spiced with cinnamon favored by the Phalangi, but she said nothing. It seemed good to her that Mishra had moved from beneath his brother's protective wing. Urza, for his part, seemed not to notice that his brother spent more time with the others, so wrapped up was the elder child in his studies. The work in the desert sun toughened Mishra. He was more muscular, the result of long hours at the dig sites, and his flesh had a deep worker's tan. His dark hair trailed after him like a banner, ornately braided in the manner of the desert. He had wider shoulders and a stauncher frame than his elder brother, and could now handle himself in any scrap without Urza's help. Both boys were tireless workers, and Terisiare saw why Bly had tried to keep them. But something more than their work bound them to her. Each of the brothers had an enthusiasm for his tasks that was contagious. Terisiare felt no need to talk to them as children. Rather, she spoke to them as trusted adults, and they returned her trust. Soon the pair were considered as vital and permanent a part of the encampment as Terisiare herself. Within 2 years, the young nobles arriving from Penregan were the same age as Urza and Mishra, and the brothers already knew the lay of the land. Remembering their own experiences, the pair always sought out the prospective bullies among the group and made it clear that no persecution of the smaller students would be permitted. Within another 2 years, the brothers were considered the de facto leaders of the student contingent, allowing Terisiare more time for her own examination of artifacts and the power stones. In the fall of the second year, word reached the camp via Bly's caravan that Urza and Mishra's father had passed on after a long illness. The word was in a terse note quickly penned from the boy's stepmother. The missive said nothing about an inheritance, and Terisiare suspected no mention would ever be made. She gave Urza the news first. He was working beneath Terisiare's tarp, clearing the dust from a device found earlier that day, driven by a coiled spring. Terisiare suspected it was merely a clock mechanism, but the young man had found carvings along the length of the spring itself, carvings that seemed to have a relationship to known Thran glyphs. When she told him of his father, Urza set his tools down and stared at the inlaid pearl top for a long moment. He rubbed his eyes and thanked Terisiare for the information, then picked his tools up again, suddenly intent on the device. Mishra responded very differently. When Terisiare gave him the news, he fled the dig site altogether, climbing up the side of the rocky tor above Terisiare's encampment. The old scholar thought to go after him, but Amal counseled against it. Mishra needed to work out his feelings on his own, the Phalangi said. Still, after dinner, Terisiare saw Urza climbing the outcropping, and the brothers sat up there a long time, watching the glimmer moon rise over the desert. Neither brother mentioned the incident afterward, and Terisiare wondered what they had said to each other on the side of that rocky tor. In the spring of the 6th year of the boy's arrival, Lauren returned, this time as an official representative of her house, instead of as a mere student. She had grown as well and was now a high-born lady with Bly, informed Terisiare with a wink and an unsubtle nudge, a string of suitors desiring both her hand and her family's monies. Officially, Lauren was to survey the encampment for its recent accomplishments and to recommend if her family should increase the sponsorship of Takesia's work. In reality, that decision could have been made back in Penregan. Growing number of young leaders of the various families had spent at least one summer working for Takesia, and fond memories now translated into hard currency. The Argivian crown did not care for Takesia's work, the archaeologist knew, but the Argivian crown was weak and treated the matter as it treated everything it did not care for. It ignored the issue. Lauren had made the long and difficult journey out to the encampment primarily to see Takesia again, and Takesia knew it. Most of the high manners and debutante softness disappeared by the end of the first evening, and by noon of the second day Lauren was prowling alongside Takesia as she moved from excavation to excavation. Takesia had something to show Lauren, a story for her to carry back to the other former students in the Argivian capital. There had been a sudden downpour the month before, a hard-hitting desert rain that had threatened several of the dig sites. Rehud, one of Amal's diggers, had heard from a nomadic family member that the rain had hit even harder farther to the north and flooded out an old dry wash, revealing what looked like a Thran machine. Rehud told Mishra. Mishra reported to Takesia, and within a day the group had mounted a small expedition north. It was a device they found, and one definitely of Thran creation. It looked at first like some sort of sailing craft, an impossibility in the desert. Long poles of ancient candlewood jutted from the exposed bank, to which had been attached what looked like sail rigging. Urza examined it and then, to Takesia's amazement, confidently declared it to be a flying craft. Something unseen in Terisiare's skies, save only in the oldest of stories. For the next week the camp activity moved to the new site, seeking to pry loose the bird-like flying machine and haul it back to the main encampment. The diggers had to work quickly to avoid the attention of less friendly desert phalange as well as the predatory sand-colored rocks. The students were pressed into duty, hauling dirt and clearing debris, and Urza and Mishra camped on the site to guard the new find. It took only a few days to pry the device free of the surrounding soil and rock, and Urza was proven right. What Takesia had thought of as sails were in fact wings. The construction did seem fashioned like a bird, and Takesia dubbed it an Ornithopter. Both wings were intact, though the tail assembly had been crushed. A small maze of wires and tubes at the heart of the craft cradled a now shattered power stone. They got the Ornithopter back to the camp 2 days before Lauren's arrival, and Takesia was glad to see the look on the young noblewoman's face when she saw the tattered remains. To any other Argivian it was a mess of fractured poles, smashed metal, and scraps of ancient fabric, but to any former student of Takesia it was a treasure. To see such a large device after spending a summer trying to pry fragments out of the rock with a small brush made the archaeologist and her students indescribably happy. Takesia also noticed that with the passage of time Lauren had grown more sure of herself. She no longer hesitated to speak, nor did she spend all her time with her old mentor. For the first few days she hovered over Urza, who had removed the crystal housing for the Ornithopter and was busy disassembling and cleaning the small device. Then, without any warning, she suddenly switched her time and attention to Mishra, who was rebuilding the larger framework of the craft itself. Terisiare did not know what if anything had happened to make law and change her interest. Neither young man ever mentioned her in the scholar's presence. The young woman returned to Penregan with promises of support for Terisiare and an order for light sailcloth, and the brothers returned to their work. Mishra had rebuilt the Ornithopter's framework, but the nature of the tail assembly defied him. Almost by unspoken agreement, Urza took over the reconstruction of the glider, discovering what wires went where and how they would function in flight. It was Urza who discovered that the sail-like wings had to be ribbed with thin shoots of candlewood in order to maintain their form in flight. For his part, Mishra confirmed that by bringing slender bows of snapped wing ribs back from the dig, along with strands of frayed wire, Urza saw that the wire was better for controlling the shape of the wings than mere rope, and another order was placed with Bly. The two young men spent hours together poring over the design, trying to determine how the tail assembly would function. In all, it took 8 months for the Ornithopter to be rebuilt. The key was the box of wires and discs that served as the craft's engine. Urza, Mishra, and even Terisiare did not know exactly how the small engine could power the large Ornithopter. They only knew that it did. Urza used the small, weak crystal that had belonged to the Suchi to power the device. It was the last day of the year, Mishra's birthday, when the craft was ready at last. The day was surprisingly warm, and a soft wind blew from the desert. There was some debate over who would get the honor and the danger of the first test flight. "I should do it," said Urza. "After all, I understand the workings of the power crystal cradle." "I should do it," countered Mishra. "The flight levers controlling the wings are mulish, and they need a strong hand to keep them in line." "I'm lighter," said Urza. "I'm stronger," snapped Mishra. "I am capable of holding the levers in place," said Urza. "And I understand the power crystals as well as you do," added Mishra quickly. "I am the elder," said Urza smugly. "And it's my birthday," shouted Mishra, the blood rising to his face. "So we are equal." Terisiare looked at the two young men and let out a deep sigh. Such disagreements were rare but were severe enough to trouble her. At last she said, "If you cannot decide, then I will have to risk my ancient bones in this device." The two young men stared at Terisiare, then looked at each other. Each simultaneously pointed to the other and said he should fly it. In the end they flipped a coin. Urza won, and Mishra did a passable job of containing his disappointment as the last of the preparations were made. A wide level place had been cleared outside the stockade gates for the craft. The blond young man climbed into the housing at the front of the Ornithopter and slowly depressed the two main levers, engaging the arcane crystal within the maze of gears and wheels that he had lovingly rebuilt over the past months. The entire craft trembled as the last of the slack in the wires was taken up and the wings accordioned out in a pair of great sails. The wings beat downward, once, twice, and then a third time. The Ornithopter gave a small hop on the third beat, and Terisiare saw Mishra start as well. The younger boy said nothing, his eyes seemed transfixed by the sight, and his hands were clenched. Terisiare wondered if he was worried for his brother or worried that his brother would damage the machine before he had a chance to try it. The device took another short hop, then another, larger leap. Dust from the heavy beating wings blew in all directions, and the Students retreated, covering their eyes and mouths from the swelling sand. One last leap, and this time the Ornithopter did not come back down. It was aloft, its wings straining against the warm air. Terisiare and the other students could hear the wires sing from the strain as the small craft, like a fledgling rock leaving the nest, leapt into the air. The Ornithopter climbed into the sky, and there was a sharp clatter as Urza threw the locking mechanism into place, fixing the wings into a solid, gliding surface. Urza was aloft for 10 minutes. He circled the encampment twice, and there was a tense second when the craft suddenly dropped 10 feet, but it quickly climbed again. Urza circled one last time, then set the Ornithopter back down on the pad of level sand. The wings unlocked and beat as he landed. The candlewood supports groaned but held the craft upright. Urza climbed out. "Hit some colder air," he said briefly to Terisiare. "Apparently that has some effect on its ability to keep aloft." "Let me try," said Mishra. Urza did not move away from the device. "We should check all the couplings for wear," he observed, still speaking to Terisiare, "and the struts for fractures. Not to mention the integrity of the power crystal." Mishra looked at Terisiare, his face clouded. "Urza," said Terisiare softly, "let your brother use the Ornithopter." Urza opened his mouth to argue, then looked at his brother and silently stepped aside. Mishra piled into the flying device. Urza leaned into the housing. "The right lever sticks, so you'll have to muscle it," he said. Mishra only grinned and shouted, "Stand away." He flung both levers into place, engaging the wings. Urza backpedaled quickly out of the way of the huge beating wings. Whatever sand had not been chased away before now was spun in a cyclone of wind. The Ornithopter went almost straight up in a single bounce. The entire encampment could hear the sharp creaking of the candlewood struts and the high-pitched whine of the wires passing through metal loops and pulleys. Urza grimaced as if the sound physically pained him. "It would have been better had we waited to check out the craft before flying it again," he said to Terisiare through gritted teeth. "Better, but not wiser," returned the old scholar. Mishra climbed 100 feet, locked the wings, then forced the craft into a swooping dive over the encampment. Sheep and goats in their pens below let out frightened bleats as the Ornithopter passed only a few feet above them. Mishra pulled back on the levers and re-engaged the wings, and the craft climbed again. "Do you think the craft needs a lighter pilot now?" said Terisiare. Urza shrugged. "Actually, I think there is enough pull in the wings to take 3 or 4 people aloft at once if we expand the housing. So the argument that you should have flown it because you were lighter was disproved," pressed the old scholar, smiling as she spoke. Urza winced but said nothing. Mishra circled the encampment twice as Urza had before. Terisiare imagined that the lad was searching for the same spot of cold air so he could hiccup the craft as had his brother. She did notice that while Urza had concentrated on keeping the craft level, Mishra continually swooped and dove, banking in one direction, then the other. Then Mishra flew over the camp once more and headed the craft westward into the deep desert. The form of the Ornithopter became a blur, then a speck on the horizon. Terisiare and Urza looked at each other. Perhaps one of the steering wires broke off at Terisiare, or the little fool wanted to see how far he could go. Urza grumbled, rushing for the rocky tor behind them to get a better view. Urza had made it only halfway up the hill when the sound of wings cutting through the warm air heralded Mishra's return. The younger brother circled the camp twice and then landed just beyond the stockade gates. By the time Mishra had touched down, Urza was waiting, his face as stern as stone. "What did you think you were doing?" he shouted as Mishra climbed out of the housing. "Bad enough that you probably stressed the pulleys with your diving about. But to fly out of sight of the camp, you might have been attacked by rocks. If you had crashed in the desert, we might not have found you." Mishra did not seem to be listening. Instead, he said, "I saw the drawings, didn't you?" Urza was brought up short and looked at his brother, puzzled. The dark-haired brother turned to Terisiare. "Out in the desert, there are drawings. Mounds of dark earth against the lighter surrounding sand. We've passed them before on foot but never noticed. But from above, you can see that they're pictures. There are dragons, genies, rocks, even minotaurs." He turned to his brother. "You saw them, didn't you?" Urza blinked at his brother. Then, more cautiously, he replied, "I was more worried about the performance of the craft." Mishra did not bother to listen. "They surround a large hillock. I'll bet if we checked that out, we'd find it some sort of old Thran encampment. It could be some Phalange holy place," started Urza, but Mishra shook his head. "No." He was emphatic. "There's nothing in the old tales about Phalange settlements in this immediate area. I think it's Thran, and I think we should investigate it. We should investigate the damage the flights did to the Ornithopter," said Urza, already prowling along the wings, pulling at the sailcloth and running his hands along the struts. Terisiare spread her hands in a gesture that encompassed both brothers. "We should celebrate," she said. "There will be time enough to do everything else in the morning." That night, students and diggers built a great bonfire in the camp and gathered around the rising flames. There was an air of excitement among the students. The young nobles had new tales to take back to archive. They had been present when Urza took the first flight and when Mishra found the great drawings in the desert. After long months of backbreaking work in shallow trenches and detailed cleaning of long dead bits of metal, here at last was something to be proud of. There were songs, and the nabbers flowed. Ra had tried to teach several of the noble boys a traditional Phalange dance. The boys had no concept of the dancer's rhythm, but since it involved waving pointed sticks, they joined in with the spirit of adventure. Mishra told and retold the story of his flight, and Terisiare knew that every young man and woman in the encampment would be clamoring for their opportunity to fly in the near future. Urza remained at the edge of the campfire, neither dancing nor drinking, and nor talking. Terisiare walked over to him. "You're enjoying yourself." "Well enough," replied the youth. "But I think we should check the rigging for any wear and tear. And if you want to put a larger housing tomorrow," said the old woman. "You are young enough for a lot of tomorrows. Enjoy yourself this evening." "I enjoy working on the devices," said Urza, watching his brother across the fire pit. The younger boy was surrounded by students as well as a few of the diggers. It seemed to Terisiare that his story grew longer and more exciting with each telling. "There are other enjoyments," said Terisiare, following Urza's gaze. "Your brother seems to have discovered that." The two were silent in the flickering firelight for a moment. Then Urza said, "I had nothing against Mishra taking his flight. I never said you did, returned Terisiare. It's just that there is stress on any object that is put to the test for the first time, continued the older brother. We should have done a full check before letting him go aloft. Of course, said Terisiare in a level tone. His own recklessness aside, he could have been hurt, said Urza. Yes. Terisiare paused. But tell that to a young man who wants to be his brother's equal. I was only being prudent. And would you have been so prudent if you had lost the toss? Asked Terisiare. Urza did not answer but stood watching his brother across the flames. Chapter 3